So tonight we're going into the second half of the Gospel of Matthew. So we're picking up at chapter 14. So we're going to be looking through Matthew chapter 14 through 28. And now we've read through all of the Gospel of Matthew. So last week I heard what were your impressions of reading for the first half. I'd love to hear your impressions of reading through all of Matthew now, especially because, like we talked about last week, a lot of times we look at the Gospels in little snippets, and it's a different read when you just read the whole thing all the way through. So what did you pick up on in the second half of Matthew, or from the whole collection?
Well, I thought that in reading the last part of Matthew, I was thinking we were more going to follow into Christmas and Advent, but to me it was more like Lent and being crucified, and so I thought, well, this is more like Easter instead of Christmas. I mean, that was my thought. I mean, there's a lot of good lessons, of course, that we hear quite often. The 10 Commandments are told to us all the time, and honor and so I just found it more interesting to read. But I thought we were going into Christmas now. This is supposed to be the birth of Christ, not the death of Christ. So, I mean, that's my thought.
Yeah, it is a little, because we walk through the church year. We walk through the Gospels as we walk through the church year, and we are ending kind of our time that we're in now and entering into Advent, which is preparation for Christmas. But the Christmas stories within the Gospel are just those first chapter or first couple of chapters, depending which Gospel we're looking at. And we are walking through, as you read the Gospel, we walk through the entire church year, and with Christmas and moving into Easter and the crucifixion.
Well, this was a chapter, these are the chapters I know better than the others because of confirmation in the Lutheran Church, because you go for so long, and this is what they really emphasize. But I did find some things here that I had questions about that, other than that, it was like reading a book I'd read before, many times. But there were some that I have, I want to ask you about, because there were things that it's like, how did this happen? I don't remember this in here.
Yeah.
But the thing about being the cornerstone of the church and all, these were all, it just was like, it was fun. It was going back. It was like reliving it all again.
Mm-hmm.
And John pointed out, you need to compare these stories with the versions in the other books. And that's a good thing to do, because you can pull out these stories and then hold them parallel with some of the other ones, and you can see the different authors' emphasis in each one too. Matthew is, as we talked about, writing to a Jewish audience, and that piece is pulled out. There's many more connections back to the Old Testament scriptures in the Gospel of Matthew. Let's go into, I've got a video from the Bible Project kind of giving an overview. So we'll look at that. We'll finish up what the structure of the second half of Matthew looks like, and then we'll go deeper into it from there. So we'll start larger and then go further in. So let me share that. So here is part 2 of Matthew.
The Gospel according to Matthew. In the first video, we saw how Matthew introduced Jesus as the Messiah from the line of David, and as a new authoritative teacher like Moses, and also as Emmanuel, which in Hebrew means God with us. After Jesus announced and taught about the arrival of God's kingdom, and after he brought the kingdom into day-to-day life among the people of Israel, we saw that Jesus was accepted by many, but rejected by others, especially Israel's religious leaders, the Pharisees. And so the big question is, how is this conflict between Jesus and Israel's leaders going to play itself out? The next large section, chapters 14 through 20, explore all the different expectations people have about the Messiah. So Jesus keeps healing sick people, and twice he even miraculously provides food for these huge crowds in the desert. One's made up of Jewish people, and the other is a non-Jewish crowd. And this sign, it's very similar to what Moses did for Israel in the wilderness. And so all these people are excited about Jesus. They think he's the great prophet and the Messiah, but not the religious leaders. Their view of the Messiah is built on passages like Psalm 2 or Daniel chapter 2 about a victorious Messiah who's going to deliver Israel and defeat the pagan oppressors. And from their point of view, Jesus, he's a false teacher. He's making blasphemous claims about himself. And so there are stories here about them increasing their opposition, hatching a plan to kill him. And so in response, Jesus, he withdraws, and he begins teaching his closest disciples what it means for him to be Israel's Messiah, because it is not what anybody expects. So Jesus asks his disciples, chapter 16, he says, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter comes up with the right answer, it seems. He says, "Well, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." But then it becomes clear that Peter's thinking about a king who's going to reign victoriously through military power. And Jesus challenges Peter, saying that, yes, I am going to become king, but through a different way. And so Jesus starts to teach on themes from the prophet Isaiah, who said that the Messianic king would suffer and die for the sins of his own people. And so Jesus, he was positioning himself as a Messianic king who reigns by becoming a servant, and who would lay down his life for Israel and the nations. Well, Peter and the disciples, they mostly just don't get it. And so Jesus enters into the fourth block of teaching, followed by a series of teachings after that. And these are all about the upside-down nature of Jesus' messianic kingdom, which turns upside down all of our value systems. So in the community of the servant king, you gain honor by serving others. And instead of getting revenge, you forgive and do good to your enemies. And in Jesus' kingdom, you gain true wealth by giving your wealth away to the poor. To follow the servant Messiah, you must become a servant yourself. In the next section, we watch the two kingdoms clash, Jesus' kingdom and that of Israel's leader. Jesus comes to Jerusalem for Passover riding in on a donkey, and the crowds are hailing him as the Messiah. And Jesus immediately marches into the courtyard of the temple, and he creates this huge disruption that brings the daily sacrifices to a halt. His actions speak louder than words here. As Israel's king, Jesus was asserting his royal authority over the temple, the place where God and Israel met together. And in Jesus' view, the temple was compromised by the hypocrisy of Israel's leaders. And so here he's challenging their authority, and naturally, they're deeply offended. And so they try to trap Jesus and shame him in public debate, and they fail. So they end up just determining to have him killed. In response, Jesus delivers his final block of teaching. He first offers this passionate critique of the Pharisees and their hypocrisy, and then he weeps over Jerusalem and its rejection of God and his kingdom. Then Jesus withdraws with the disciples, and he starts telling them what's going to happen. He's going to be executed by these leaders, but in doing so, they're going to create their own demise, because instead of accepting Jesus' way of the peaceful kingdom, they're going to take the road of revolt against Rome, and so Jerusalem and its temple are going to be destroyed. But, Jesus says, that is not the end of the story. He's going to be vindicated after his death by his resurrection. And one day, he'll return and set up his kingdom over all nations. And so in the meanwhile, the disciples need to stay alert and stay committed to just announcing Jesus and his kingdom and spreading the good news. And so with all of that ringing in the disciples' ears, the story comes to its climax. That night, Jesus takes the disciples aside and he celebrates a Passover meal with them. The Passover retells the story of Israel's rescue from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. And then Jesus takes the bread and the wine from this meal as new symbols, showing that his coming death would be a sacrifice that would redeem his people from slavery to sin and evil. After the meal, Jesus is arrested, He's put on trial before the Sanhedrin, a council of Jewish leaders, and they reject his claim to be the Messiah. They charge him with blasphemy against God. Then Jesus is brought before the Roman governor, Pilate, and he thinks Jesus is innocent, but he gives in to the pressure from the Jewish leaders, and he sentences Jesus to death by crucifixion. So Jesus is led away by Roman soldiers and crucified. Now, you'll notice right here in this section that just like Matthew did in the opening chapters, he increases the number of references to the Old Testament. He's trying to show that Jesus' death was not a tragedy or a failure. Rather, it was the surprising fulfillment of all of the old prophetic promises. Jesus came as the servant Messiah, spoken of by Isaiah. He was rejected by his own people, but instead of judging them, he is judged on their behalf, bearing the consequences of their sin. So the crucifixion scene, it comes to a close, and Jesus' body is placed in a tomb. But the book ends with a surprising twist, the last chapter. The disciples, they discover on Sunday morning that Jesus' tomb is empty. And then all of a sudden people start seeing Jesus alive from the dead. And the book concludes with the risen Jesus giving a final teaching called the Great Commission. Jesus says that he is now the true king of the world. And so he sends his disciples out to all nations with the good news that Jesus is Lord and that anyone can join his kingdom by being baptized and by following his teachings. And echoing all the way back to his name, Emmanuel, God with us, from chapter 1, Jesus' last words in the book to his disciples are, "I will be with you." It's a promise of Jesus' presence until the day he finally returns. And that's the gospel according to Matthew.
So there's the summary from the Bible Project, which is helpful for seeing some of that structure as we talked about last week. Anything else that you pulled from the Bible Project this week? And Toby, just so you know, you're muted. I did mute you, just so you know.
Petra was here and I didn't want her, she was telling me something I had to hear, and
That's fine.
she's leaving. She's left now. She waved to you to say hi.
I should have waved back. I didn't see her. I was watching the video with you guys too. One thing that I wanted to expand on farther about from what the Bible Project was this the Sanhedrin Council. So we don't use that word quite as much, just in we're just not as familiar with it. But the Sanhedrin was a court of law, and its origin comes from Numbers chapter 11:16. And in there it says, "Bring me 70 men from Israel, known to you as elders and officers of the people. Take them to the tent of meeting and have them stand there with you." And so that is the biblical origin for forming the Sanhedrin. And Sanhedrin just comes from the word council, is what it means. And there, each town would have had a Sanhedrin or a council that acted as a court of law. And this wasn't a court of law that was in the same way that we think of court of law. It also had the religious implications as a court of law, a religious court of law. So each town had a Sanhedrin, but then there was the Great Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish high court. And that's what we're talking about in the Gospels that Jesus goes before, is this Great Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court. And in that, there would have been a high priest, and then 70 Pharisees, Sadducees, chief priests, elders, and scribes. And they would divide it up. So it wasn't just 90% Pharisees and a couple Sadducees, but they tried to divide it up kind of equally in that. So there was representation from different sects and understanding of Judaism that were within the Great Sanhedrin and within the Sanhedrins. The Great Sanhedrin would have been the final authority on Jewish law. And they were set up to sit in a semicircle. And if people came forward, that witnesses could bring a case forward. And then there were lawyers that were representing other people. People would represent themselves. And so if somebody was defending themselves, they would come forward and be able to bring their own witnesses forward with them as well. And then the Sanhedrin would hear out both sides and speak with each other. Another thing that's interesting is that the lesser members of the Sanhedrin would be the ones who would be permitted to speak first before the greater members, so that they wouldn't be intimidated by others, that the lesser members would have their voice first, so that they wouldn't be afraid to speak after somebody else spoke. And so that is the Sanhedrin that we have from this, from Numbers. But any questions on that? Otherwise, let's jump into, Toby, some of your questions and more particulars within the second half of Matthew.
I mean, go anywhere?
Sure, let's go anywhere.
Not from the.
We'll come back to Herodotus. I've got another video, but I don't want to just do video back to back. But we'll come back to, I want to make sure we do watch this one. It talks a little bit about kind of the political history that's going on behind the scenes right now and leading up to this, which helps explain some of the turmoil.
Well, I've got a couple of things, but one of them was when they talk about Jesus ordered them, tell no one about the vision until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. And I don't remember knowing that before. Was there a reason for that?
So why don't you say which verse?
That's 17 chapter, verse 9.
So everybody can find it too. So 17.
What chapter? Excuse me, what chapter?
Chapter 17, verse 9. As they were coming down the mountain,
Oh.
Jesus ordered them, tell no one about the vision until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead.
Yeah, and so this is an interesting part of the Gospels, is there's various times where Jesus tells the disciples, hey, don't tell anyone, like, don't tell anybody about this. And even when we look at the ending of later on, when we're in Luke, we hear towards the end, it says, hey, don't tell anybody about all of this. And obviously people told people, because we know these stories and they're being written down. But so this echoes back as they're coming down the mountain. So what they've just seen while they're up at this mountain, tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead, is that they're seeing Elijah, and the understanding was that this expectation that Elijah would come before the coming of the Messiah, that Elijah would return. And so they're bringing that's the importance of this vision, to show,
Okay.
look, this is Elijah. Now it's shown up in this vision. So, and here is Christ, the Messiah. And so they're pulling those threads and pulling in people's expectations and pulling the threads from the old story as well. There would be political reasons too, and safety reasons why Jesus might be telling them, don't tell anybody about this, because this is a pretty big deal, a big event, that if they saw Elijah and then in connection with Christ, that could cause Christ to be crucified prematurely at that point, or put an end to his ministry even earlier, or be a threat to his disciples. And he's still gathering additional disciples and has more work to do at this point. And so is also telling people, don't share this, is another understanding of that.
So basically, it's like this has to happen in a certain order, in a certain way, and you can't mess with it.
Right. So Matthew is setting it up. Look, these are the signs they are not showing up the way that 100% the way we expected them to, but look at all the ways they are showing up. And these are how we're interpreting the prophets from before. And look, here's this sign, here's that sign, here's that sign. And Matthew's really pointing that out because he's speaking to a Jewish audience.
Now, is this the first time that they hear the prophecy of Christ dying? You know, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed by human hands. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised from the dead. Is this the first where this is all really laid out?
I thought Jesus kind of alludes to it earlier. Because he speaks to them quite often about like the kingdom of heaven and the coming of that and kind of end times too, but they don't get it.
Okay.
So as you go on, it's being spelled out more and more and more, like in more detail as they go around, go through. So it's being alluded to throughout all of it, because even before that, if you go back just one chapter into 16:21, from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day raised.
Well, and in Matthew, he says it a couple of times too. I mean, it's like repeated.
Yep.
And in some ways, it's like they get more detailed. He gets more detailed as it goes along.
Right. Yeah, and that's also a literary device that's being used throughout the Gospel of Matthew. Is he'll repeat the point that he really wants you to get and wants you to hear. Because also remember, this isn't just the Gospels. Historically were not just read as some, you wouldn't necessarily read them quietly to yourself, but that they would have been heard. And so that's when you hear something, it's a different understanding. So even if you were to read it out loud to yourself, you might hear different things than you hear reading it quietly, or listening to an audio Bible, and you would hear it a little differently too.
The other question I have a lot of them, but in the next, let's see, Matthew 18, 18, he says, truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. What does that mean?
What verse are you on?
Verse 18.
Oh, 18, chapter 18?
No. Chapter 18, verse 18. Yeah.
Yeah, and the explanation for that can be tied with, if you jump ahead to chapter 18, verse 21. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times. Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. That these binding and loosing upon the earth is also kind of that binding of that we do upon others by not forgiving one another too. And so there's ways that we bind each other, and so that's part of what Jesus is talking about in this, is the way that we kind of hold each other into or away from the kingdom of God just by the way our expectations of them, or past sins or faults that we hold people to that. And Jesus is telling them that like if the kingdom of God is, if it is to be heaven on earth, then what you bind on earth has an impact on heaven too. That it's all connected with one another if it is to be heaven on earth. he's also commissioning them though too in this place. So it's not just a teaching, but also a giving of power to them in responsibility as well. Saying, I mean, kind of like Spider-Man hearing from from his aunt, with great power comes great responsibility, and Jesus is telling them that too. I give you the power to do the things that I have been doing, that you have that the Holy Spirit will come upon you and you will have that power to do even greater things than these, Jesus tells them. But that comes with a great responsibility to be able to do that.
I also like the part on 1923. You know, he starts out with, these are things we've all heard. You know, it'll be harder for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven, and it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. But then he says, they say, well, who can be saved then? And it says, for mortals it's impossible, but for God all things are possible. And that, I thought, that's one of my favorite verses.
Yeah. And that verse,
because he kind of hits you with how horrible you are, and then says, but it'll be okay.
Yeah. And sometimes we miss that. We miss kind of both ways. Sometimes we miss seeing the ways that we hold on to other things too closely and we're not willing to follow God. And sometimes we miss the ways that God says, you know, it's going to be okay. Like, you can let go. It will be okay. Like, I've got you. So one of the things we also talked about last week too, and I encourage you to do, is as you read through things, so to go back to the Old Testament and some of the places where it said this, you can find, where did it say that in the Old Testament? If you're having trouble finding it, you can always Google it. Where is this in the Old Testament? And you can find it that way. But to read it in the context of the Old Testament, and then also to hear, so what's the background story of this prophecy, or of this scripture that's being said again in the Gospel of Matthew? Because that is what this audience would have already known. They would have known the stories and the expectations that were placed around those prophecies or around those pieces of scripture. And as they were hearing them be repeated later on. Another element that's really common to Matthew is this phrase, throw them into utter darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Yeah.
You probably started to get sick of hearing that the closer you got towards the end of Matthew. And that's a piece that's unique in Matthew and does come up many places, although it also shows up in Luke too. With that piece.
What does it mean? What does it mean when he says, I will not tell you what authority I'm doing things?
So part of the gospel was, part of the story is that Jesus telling them things, and then part of it is also Jesus showing them things, and that it's not just a telling, because Jesus also circles back at different places and says, I could tell you this, but you don't believe me anyways. So I'm not going to tell it to you because you're just trying to use it against me, which is what
Okay.
they're trying to do in some places. And so instead, it's an act of, let me show you, or a statement of, you're not, it doesn't even matter because you're not going to believe me anyways.
He doesn't think much about the scribes and the Pharisees.
He is not. And so there is quite a bit of conflict between scribes and Pharisees that are at this point in time, and they don't believe the same things. They have different sources of who they think is right, and so they're in conflict with one another, and Jesus kind of walks in and says, you're all wrong. You're too focused on who's right, and you're not actually even focused on God anymore. Which I think that'll lead us nicely too into this video on kind of the power structures in Judea at this time. And I think you'll see as we're watching this video, the impact that that has had on this, on why Jesus maybe did some of the things he did in the way the story is told too. So I'm going to share this. Just so you know, there's going to be some things where he says that it should be clear by now because this is part of a larger series. So just ignore those parts.
It ought to be clear by now that Judea didn't have any rules concerning royal succession. It should have. Herod's death in 4 BCE drove the royal family into chaos, as almost all of his children started jockeying for the position of heir presumptive. The trouble began a few years earlier, when Herod had his chosen successors, Alexander and Aristobulus, executed for being more popular than him. Next in line was his son Herod Bethus, who is married to Aristobulus's daughter Herodias. We're going full Habsburg now. As Herodias was the most legitimate claimant by direct descent, Herod Bethus was generally understood to be his father's first pick. But in the final months of Herod's life, Bethus had conspired with his older brother Antipater to assassinate the king. When this was discovered, Antipater was executed, Herod Bethus was exiled to Rome, and Herod rewrote his entire will so that Judea would be partitioned between his next 3 sons and his sister Salome in such a convoluted fashion as to keep any of his heirs from becoming too powerful. This plan was entirely contradictory to Herod's original mission to make Judea into a great Mediterranean power. So Bethus immediately petitioned Emperor Augustus to invalidate the will and confirm him as king of Judea. The emperor gave Bethus a flat no. Judea would be partitioned in accordance with Herod's final will. Augustus made clear, however, that these domains would not be ruled by kings. All of Herod's chosen successors would be tetrarchs, national figureheads in their own right, but nevertheless all subject to the laws and judicial rulings of the Great Sanhedrin. Neither would these domains be hereditary. When a tetrarch died or abdicated their throne, the territory they had ruled would be automatically annexed by Rome. The days of Jewish independence were numbered.
Portable heater is taking over the heating market in the U.S.
Sick of sky-high heating bills every winter? This jet engineer just discovered how to heat homes for almost
what
zero
happened?
cost, sending shockwaves through energy company boardrooms. He built a device that...
There we go.
Ironically, the first kingdom to lapse would be Judea itself. Archelaus may have been the worst possible candidate to rule over the historic Jewish heartland. His mother, Malthaki, was Samaritan, not Jewish, and thus his legitimacy was contested by the Great Sanhedrin. Archelaus had also been responsible for carrying out many of his father's atrocities, most notably the purge of the Hasmoneans, and upon taking the throne had 3,000 protesters executed in the temple during Passover. But the final blow to Archelaus' reign came in 6 CE, when he announced his intention to marry Glaphyra, the widow of his late brother Prince Alexander. Archelaus assumed that doing right by his brother in what he thought was accordance with Jewish law would endear him to the Sanhedrin, but it actually made for a perfect excuse to get rid of him. For one, Glaphyra wasn't Jewish. For two, she was already remarried to King Juba of Mauritania. She divorced Juba in order to marry Archelaus, but Jewish law prohibited divorcees from remarrying while their exes were still alive. Nevertheless, the two apparently had genuine feelings for each other because Archelaus willingly accepted the Sanhedrin's order to abdicate the throne and spend the rest of his life in exile in Gaul. So let's take a step back and look where we are at this point. There were 3 separate Jewish kingdoms, all of whom were undeniably independent, yet all of them answered to a single central legislature in the capital of the ancestral Jewish homeland, which was now a Roman province. I can't blame the Sanhedrin for getting rid of Archelaus, but by doing so, they wiped their own country off the map, and effectively became a tool by which Rome exercised its influence over the remaining tetrarchies. When Judea became a Roman province, it received a Roman governor, Quirinius, who immediately began a census of the new territory. Whereas the Jews had collected taxes based on income, the Romans collected taxes based on the value of the land one owned, which required a census to assess. This was much more difficult to do than a simple income tax, but the Romans believed it would encourage their subjects to use their land as productively as possible. But as you may recall from an earlier episode, the Jews didn't believe in private property. By having their land assessed, individual Judeans would be implicitly claiming ownership of it, so participating in this census would be a form of blasphemy. This caused a schism among the ruling Pharisees, and one Pharisee dissenter, Judas of Gamala, invoked his status as a direct male descendant of King David to proclaim himself a Messiah. The concept of a Messiah originates with Isaiah's prophecies about the reign of King Hezekiah, which would make him a Messiah. Judaism also regards the notably not Jewish Cyrus the Great as a Messiah for enabling the Jewish leadership to return from exile in Babylon. Basically, a Messiah originally meant anyone who brought about Jewish independence of liberty, but by the 1st century CE, that had changed. After the failure of the Hasmonean and Herodian dynasties, a certain revisionism began to take hold among the Pharisees, which viewed the descendants of King David as the only true heirs to the Jewish throne, and believed that the Jewish nation could never be truly perfected until the Davidic line was restored. Now, let's be clear. The Davidic dynasty had been out of power for almost 600 years by this point, and claimants to the Davidic line already existed. Remember the Exilarchs? But they were in Babylon, which was then part of the Parthian Empire, and had no interest in returning to Jerusalem. Nevertheless, with so much time having passed since the Davidic era, many Jews who could claim direct male descent from the Davidic kings also lived in Judea, and Judas of Gamala was one of them. Judas and several followers resigned from the Sanhedrin and went into the countryside, urging Jews not to register for the census and burning the farms of those who did. Quirinius quickly crushed this rebellion, but Judas survived, and despite being few in number, his followers, thereafter known as the Zealots, would become one of the driving forces in Jewish politics for the next century. So too would the phenomenon of messianic claimants.
Salome's realm consisted of Philistia and Alexandria. Yes, we're going full Habsburg now.
All right. I wanted to pause it there to see, are you starting to hear what some of the conflict is that's going on behind the scenes here? And I'm not expecting you to follow everything that they said, but that this was not the first claim that Jesus was not the first one to say, I'm the Messiah. The people had been hearing this before, and Messiah had a broader meaning than just the way that we understand Messiah now today. And so there was so much going on, and Jesus is at this time coming in and being shoved in the middle of all of this tension, and Jesus is speaking to this tension as well and offering an alternative to the way that the people are going. And so the path that they're going down is a path that is tearing apart their faith traditions, it's tearing apart the communities, and it's creating all of these factions within it. And Jesus is coming and saying, look, you're showing them what they're doing, and also speaking out by pointing out to everyone, here's the flaws in everything that you're doing. Here's the flaws in the way the Pharisees are doing things. Here's the flaws in the way the Sadducees are doing things. He speaks out against the zealots when he speaks out against the violence, because they were willing to do violence against people. And so some of those pieces that he's saying is like, not just to us as here's ways to live, but he's also speaking directly to what's happening in that time and in that place.
Salome's realm consisted of Philistia and Alexandrium. Its capital was at Yamnia, from which it gets its name. Salome's reign was uneventful, and the territory became part of Roman Judea upon her death in 10 CE. That same year in Jerusalem, Hillel the Elder also died. He was replaced as Nasi by his son Simon, who struggled to maintain the stability of the Great Sanhedrin. In 15, Judea got a new prefect, Valerius Gratus, who forced the Sanhedrin to appoint a new high priest every year until they found one he liked. Having accomplished this task, Gratus retired from his post, but he had set a precedent. The high priest served at the pleasure of Rome and could be removed at any time. In fact, more men would serve as high priest in 60 years of Roman occupation than during the entire First Temple period. Gratus's replacement was Pontius Pilate. Antipas and Philip were the youngest of Herod's heirs, and thus held on to their respective realms for decades longer than the other tetrarchs. They were also in a really good position, as the Galilee had been both the breadbasket of Judea and the ancestral home for many of the kingdom's professional soldiers. The two brothers effectively ran their domains as a single kingdom to their mutual benefit. Ironically, it was this mutual cooperation between brothers that would prove the greatest danger to the region. While visiting Herod Bethus in Rome, Antipas fell for Herodias, and the two basically arranged a wife swap. This, as you may recall, is exactly what had gotten Archelaus in trouble. But Antipas had an exceptionally good relationship with the new Emperor Tiberius. He'd even built a new capital city in his honor. Because of this, the Sanhedrin was pressured into letting the issue slide. However, the same could not be said for the king of Nabatea, the father of Antipas's previous wife, who swiftly declared war on the Galilee. At the same time, the divorce provoked an outcry among the citizenry. The Galilee had long been Judea's most religiously devout province, and the political center of both the Pharisees and the Zealots. In the wake of Antipas's new marriage, a new player emerged, John the Baptist. John the Baptist lived in the Galilean enclave of Perea, and believed the royal marriage to be an act of wickedness that would presage the coming of the Messiah, because Herodias was not only a divorcee, but also the tetrarch's half-niece. To that end, John began inviting Jews to be ritually purified by immersing them in the Jordan River. Coincidentally, Perea was also the part of the Galilean kingdom that bordered Nabatea, and as John gained followers, Antipas began to worry that Perea would simply defect to the invading Arabs out of protest. Herodias' adult daughter Salome blamed John the Baptist himself for starting the war, and famously had his head sent to her on a silver platter. Naturally, this accomplished nothing. Nabatea easily occupied Perea, and the Galilo-Nabatean War continued for several more years. For decades, Antipas and Philip's only challenge had been to keep the Zealots from expanding their influence into Roman Judea. The war made that impossible, and it got worse. By the year 33, Galilee had produced a second messianic claimant, and he was heading to Jerusalem.
So the tension was growing even further in the political pieces around that. I thought he also did a good job explaining the pressure that the high priest was under from Rome, that the high priest they were regularly being removed if they were not following Rome. And so even though they were claiming to be separate, claiming to be following, they were also under pressure from Rome and would be removed if they spoke out against Rome, or if they didn't keep the peace well enough or upset Rome and weren't doing a good enough job controlling things, that Rome would come in and just get rid of the high priest and appoint a new one. And so the Sanhedrin was being put under pressure then to protect Rome. And we hear that as Jesus is speaking out against those protections that the Sanhedrin is placing upon Rome, and speaking out against the way that people are being loyal to that which actually they should not be claiming or believing has power over them. And Jesus even he takes that coin, he says, look, give unto Caesar what Caesar's, that this isn't like we as the Sanhedrin are being under their influence, but we don't need to be, like, give them what they want, but they're not actually the highest power here, that God is, and we're forgetting that, is what Jesus is telling them. And Jesus coming on the stage is also putting pressure on them in the midst of all of this other tension and struggles that are going on. Any thoughts or reflections on that history alongside the you're reading?
Can I ask you another question?
Sure.
This is something that's bothered me forever. And it's that you have to have the betrayal of Jesus in order to have the ending you want.
Okay.
And so it's, everybody talks about how horrible Judas was betraying Jesus, but without the betrayal, you don't have the crucifixion and you don't have the risen Christ.
Right. So people have interpreted that in different ways. One way, in the most traditional way, is that Jesus knew that Judas would betray him, and that was Judas's role, was that Judas was to betray him. And and that's kind of that traditional. Another way that sometimes people interpret it is that Jesus is pointing out to them, like the prophets before, were pointing out to people. It's not that the prophets, when they would speak, it's not that they saw the future and the future was written, but that they were speaking to where they saw the people were and where they saw things were happening. And they had a clarity of mind, and so could tell what would happen next because they understood what was happening now and saw that clearly. And so another way of understanding that is, yes, it's not that the betrayal had to happen or even that the crucifixion had to happen, but that the where humanity was that we were in a place and have been in a place where it was inevitable that it would happen, because humanity was on a path that the only way that they saw to solve problems were through violence. And that's what Jesus was showing, was through his life and death and resurrection, was breaking that cycle of violence. But was telling them, look, we're going down this path, and I'm going to continue on this path of speaking truth, even though speaking truth, when you speak truth, it leads to people betraying you because they don't want that truth to come out, or the truth is too difficult. It leads to death, but that truth is more powerful than that, and it is more powerful to not continue the cycles of violence than it is to just fall back into it. But I do think I know sometimes people take Judas and just talk about how awful he was too. But I think there's a lot of hurt and a lot of pain in Judas as well, and to hear that in the story too.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, it's written into the story, just that pain and how much it is that I think God's heart would go out to Judas too. Does that answer your question, Toby?
Yeah, most of this is just more thinking, I mean, it just brings more thought and more connections. But yeah, that helped. There's another part where he talks also, and I can't find it. I was trying to find it, and where he talks about the inevitability. There's that this has to happen, and he understands that. And it wasn't, it was something previous, and I can't remember what it was, and I don't remember ever reading it before, but it was like, this was inevitable.
He says a few times, he also just going to Jerusalem and that he will be killed is inevitable too.
That's what I mean, is that there's a part where he kind of questions why, and then he realizes that this has to be this way.
Yeah.
So does he know the outcome? Just, I mean, I think obviously I don't know that, but do you think he knows the total outcome at the point is that when he starts this, he knows where that's all going?
I think he is fully aware of what he's doing and the ramifications of it. And what with that, I mean, watching what's going on in the history, watching the power dynamics, what other outcome could there have been from inserting into all of that tension and into the powers that be that don't want to give up that power and are afraid of the pressure from Rome because they're afraid of losing that power.
Okay.
And I think that's part of why he starts telling his disciples, this is going to happen, and starts making them aware even when they don't want to accept it.
But on his march, when he's going to his death, he heals people along the way. That to me tells me that he is trying to let people know all the goodness that he can do on this earth. So why are you taking me away? Too. I mean, I know that you said that he knows this is inevitable, that he would probably go to his death, but at the same time, he's doing all these wonderful things along the way on his path, and he's saying, and I'm thinking, well, then when you see all this, why do you want to crucify him? He's doing such good things here on earth, and I guess I haven't thought about that. I don't know. I guess it's the way the Bible's written, but I feel so bad. What he shouldn't have had to die, and yet he died for our sins. So, yeah.
Well, and Jesus is showing, he's modeling that alternative way, the way of the kingdom of God, and that is a path of healing, even in the face of death, even in the face of violence. It still is a path of healing, and so Jesus is modeling that to the people, and that's not the end of the story. The crucifixion is not the end. The end of the story is Christ rising and commissioning the disciples and saying, look, this path of healing is so powerful that it does overcome violence. It does break that cycle. And it's more powerful than anything else people are trying right now or have been trying for generations. But the amount of violence in the Gospels is something that multiple people have looked at too. There's a book, Rita Parker, let me grab it. Rita Brock and Rebecca Parker Proverbs of Ashes, they kind of look at the violence that is in the gospel story and in the Bible itself, and how to interpret that. What impact does uplifting the violence in the way Christianity has uplifted the violence? What impact does that have on our wider society? Because in some ways it does have a negative impact on our society, and in some ways some of the violence and the way it's discussed in our culture is not true to the Jesus path of healing and care. And so this is another, they kind of relook at that and relook at what does it mean to be saved, and not in the way that it's often used in pop Christianity, but more as a healing piece, and what type of violence has the overemphasis on the crucifixion and the underemphasis on Christ's healing and resurrection had on our own society and violence within it. So this is their kind of smaller book. If you really like, you can read Saving Paradise, but that one's kind of, it's hefty. Their other one's pretty hefty, but it can be an interesting read and perspective. And there's a lot of different, the Gospels, there's so much written from different perspectives, and it's helpful to read different types of commentaries and things. There's commentaries that would walk you through just a single book. There's also ones that look at it from different perspectives. It can be helpful to read. There's like a women's Bible commentary, and that looks at the Bible through a women's perspective. There's a global Bible commentary, and that looks at it through the perspective of other cultures. Because from different cultures, people hear the Bible differently, just because our experience does impact the way that we hear these stories. And that can be helpful to pull us out of the place of, I know this story and I know what it means. Because sometimes there's deeper meanings we're missing because we're only hearing it from one perspective.
I think one of the most incredible parts of this is when he says, do I really have to do this? It makes him, that's what makes him so human.
Yeah.
And it's just, and then, yeah, okay, I have to.
Yeah. The humanity piece is important of who Christ is. That is where a lot of the message and a lot of the power is too. Any other closing thoughts on Matthew? We'll get into Mark next. And now that we've read one of them, we'll be able to look more at kind of how the books are a little different from each other too. But Matthew is a good introduction to remind us of how deeply they're connected with the Hebrew Bible and the scriptures we just finished reading from the Old Testament.
How far do we read?
All right, so for Mark, we're gonna do, so our next, we won't have class next week because it's the
Thanksgiving for the church.
Right, because we've got Thanksgiving. And next Wednesday is the community Thanksgiving Eve service at 7. And so that'll be, we're doing it at Faith Lutheran this year because they've got a larger sanctuary. And so I hope you'll join us for that. There's not pie this year. That's the one difference of the other years. But Sister Kathleen Atkinson will be one of the speakers, and Rachel Mongi will be the other speaker on and giving an update on homelessness. What's the status of homelessness in the Bismarck area? So we won't have class next week, so we'll pick up again December 1st. And Mark is shorter, and so I'd encourage you to read all of Mark for December 1st. So that gives us 2 weeks, 1 through 16. I really want you to experience reading the Gospels in their entirety so that you can get that full picture since you read them so often broken up. And this one, Mark has that shorter ending and a longer ending too. So you'll get to check those out. Well, thank you, everyone.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gretchen.